Thank you so much, Lonnie, Andrew, Annie, and Roosevelt have been such great partners for us here in working through the Teagle program. And so I'll say more about that later. But what I'd like to do is get us started in meeting four really transformative artists: Langston Hughes, Billie Holiday, Lorraine Hansberry, and Dr. Martin Luther King. And one of the most interesting things about this great group of people is that collectively they created what is simply one of the most transformed texts in American history. What I'd like to do is give you a brief overview of that and then talk about how that applies to my classrooms. Langston Hughes is a poet who was born in 1901 and died in 1967. He's often considered a leading figure of the Harlem Renaissance. To get my engineering students here at our STEM university excited, I usually do this. The space between my fingers is the entire collected works of Robert Frost that he wrote over his entire life. It includes two short stories, two one-act plays, A Mask of Reason and A Mask of Mercy. When Langston Hughes died in 1967, less than 11 months before Dr. King's assassination, he had his name on 52 books. Now, you can't see exactly how far my hands extend, but that 52 book count does not include 21 years of weekly newspaper articles for the Chicago Defender, nor does it include 19 plays, 5 of which start on Broadway. Langston Hughes is a major figure associated with Harlem. And so today, we're going to talk about one of his most significant poems of all time, that poem being Harlem. And the poem Harlem is found in the resource materials. And so I'll take our time and show you kind of the final version. I'm going to move quickly at the start to get your mind excited and thinking about possibilities for your classroom before we come back to application. This poem was published in 1951, but it didn't look anything like this at the start. Hughes eventually asked in 1951, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? When Langston Hughes first drafted that poem, it was about 3 pages long and it contained other poems with it. And when he put together Montage of a Dream Deferred, what he actually did is he started with the logic of a film and the aesthetic of collage. He started cutting up all his poems into short pieces and mashing them together and pulling them apart. And so Hughes eventually ended up with the poem you see. But what I'd like to do for just 1 second is show you the original first draft that Langston Hughes actually wrote. And when I found this about 20 years ago, I was quite excited because this was something that Langston Hughes was very excited about. In his own hand, on August 7th, 1948, this is the poem he first wrote. Look how he starts. Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? The next line took me about 11 months to decipher, but he says, does it rot? He started writing the letters R-O-T, and then he quickly covered them over with fester. If you look very closely, you'll see under that F-E-S an R-O-T. He didn't take time to cross it out. As you go further down the original draft that Hughes composed, you'll see that Hughes didn't have the line, does it sag like a heavy load? That came from a play he was working on called Emperor of Haiti, which he brought that imagery in and then added it. And look at the final original line. Or does it atom-like explode and leave deaths in its wake? The very first word on the next page continues that line, explode, and then leave deaths in its wake. Hughes was actually thinking about atomic bombs dropped in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And those bits of evidence are really startling for us to see. Now, still keeping with the excitement of things, and then we'll get back to the application. This is Langston Hughes's inspiration. The final stanza of Billie Holiday's most famous song against the practice of lynching. The final stanza of Billie Holiday's song is, here is fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot. Hughes is actually beginning his poem where Billie Holiday's song ends, when he says, does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or does it rot, in his original draft? The context for this is complex, but I want to move quickly. Hughes is telling the story of Harlem as the summation of the Great Migration of what happens when Black bodies travel north to cities like Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, and Harlem. And he finds that they no longer lynch bodies in Harlem, but they lynch dreams. In 1951, the Tuskegee Institute issued its first year of saying there were no official lynchings in America, but they offered a warning. Bombings and other kind of violence had taken place. Hughes is picking up on this notion of a different way to intimidate folks, and so Billie Holiday's song is very, very key. But beginning with those origins, then projected it into a completely new stratosphere when Lorraine Hansberry took that line, A Raisin in the Sun, and turned it into her Broadway production that debuted March 19th, 1959 at the Ethel Barrymore Theater. The poem we're starting with, Harlem, was actually printed inside of every playbill. The title from the play took its knowledge there, but what's fascinating is Hansberry was incredibly imaginative about thinking about how to use Hughes's poem. So her working title was The Crystal Stair, based on a different Langston Hughes poem called Mother to Son. She changed it later and focused on this notion. And throughout the opening scenes that you should hopefully now see in front of you, you'll have a sense that she is playing with this idea of food being wasted. So when I teach this in my class, we talk about the idea of how Hansberry transforms the imagery that Hughes gives us, inherited from Billie Holiday, and puts forward a different idea of it. In the passage in front of us, Walter is having his breakfast made by Ruth. If you don't know the play, A Raisin in the Sun, Ruth asks him how he wants his eggs, and he says anything but scrambled, and then she immediately scrambles the eggs. She takes a fork to them. Throughout the scene that Hansberry publishes, nowhere does anybody eat the eggs. Just as in the food that is prepared in Langston Hughes's poem that wastes and rots and goes away, Hansberry picks up on this notion and has nobody actually eat these eggs. They sit on the plate. They are a thing that is deferred. Now, if you are knowledgeable about the play A Raisin in the Sun, you know its characters, Lena, who everyone leans on, Bobo, who was the name of Emmett Till's favorite friend, Beneatha, for whom everything is beneath her, and Walter Lee, probably a place on Hansberry's father, Leo. You can actually take 5 of the 6 images in Hughes's poem and imaginally see how they play out in Hansberry's work. The raisin in the sun becomes things for students to find, such as the child Ruth is thinking about having aborted. It's also the plant that mother has to keep nourishing until it dries up. Running is exactly what Bobo does with the money. Walter Lee talks about they've taken his dream and butchered it up like meat, and he is playing on the notion of rotten meat. The heavy load is exactly what Ruth sags under when she collapses at the very beginning of the play. And of course, the explosions are multiple fold. They include the idea that Walter Lee explodes in anger at Lena, but they also are the really important idea of what's happening in Clybourne Park. The notion in Clybourne Park being that bombs are running out Black residents who move into white neighborhoods, the threat that looms over it at the very end of the play. So this then becomes the final iteration of something very important before I turn to how this all translates to the classroom. Hansberry's play starts on March 19th, 1959, and there's a very important observer about how integrated the audiences are and how much of an immediate success that play is. That observer is a pastor down in Montgomery, Alabama. I had a research assistant a number of years ago named Megan Myers that went through all the copies of the Montgomery Advertiser and the New York Times that Dr. King read, and she found that Dr. King was looking and observing how Raisin in the Sun was being portrayed, and there were a number of reviews and iterations that talked about the play being about dreams, exploding, and shattering. There was one incredible review by Robert Shelton in which he said, this is a play about shattered dreams. So if you follow the timeline with me quickly, on the very next Sunday, Dr. King gave a Palm Sunday sermon. The Sunday after that, he gave an Easter sermon, but the first free sermon he had, he delivered for the first time in his life a sermon about dreams. They were not optimistic, positive, hopeful dreams. They were about shattered dreams and blasted hopes. They were not a mere throwaway line. They were the thesis of what he was talking about. Dr. King saw the importance of a raisin in the sun and started for the first time engaging in the metaphor of dreams because Langston Hughes's poem had been transformed into a play, had now become central to his thinking. Now, it's a long story to track everything that Dr. King ends up doing with that dream, but I'll tell you quickly that what starts to happen is from that date, April 5th, 1959, he then starts adding the notion of the American dream. Finally, he goes back to the poetry of Langston Hughes's I Dream a World. And in late 1962, he is riffing off Langston Hughes's poetry to shape his own I Have a Dream speech, a topic we can happily get to later, which I've talked and tracked extensively. The final iteration of this transformative text that I want to talk about before I get to how this translates to the classroom is that not only does this poem end up as a play and then central to Dr. King's dreaming, but the language we use today to talk about immigrants and dreamers is directly linked to Langston Hughes's poem. Immigrants going through the process are called dreamers because their citizenship has been deferred. So what we have before us is a song from Billie Holiday that is the definitive statement on lynching in America. Time magazine named it the most important song of the 20th century. We have an iconic poem from Langston Hughes that models modernism and becomes a key text for talking about what happens once you think you make it to the place where your dreams begin. We have a Broadway hit and Hollywood standout film, one of the first Hollywood films with an all-black cast, taking this idea and presenting it to the world. Dr. King transforming the idea into a completely different iteration to propel as one of many cogs of the civil rights movement. And it's finally, like so much of Shakespeare's own language, made its way into kind of our daily lives and our daily living in these particular ways. So to get you excited and thinking about the ways in which any of those artists, authors, personalities might fit in your classroom, I provided that context. What I'd like to do for the next 10 or 12 minutes is talk to you about what I do then in the classroom with that. And I start the way I did because you're all incredible teachers and have skills and abilities and can think about your own lessons and where these things fit. And so generating ideas for where you're already doing unique things is always the best place to start. There are two big iterations that I want to tell you about. You can imagine that in kind of a typical literature classroom, one where there are juniors or seniors going in to maybe be future teachers or already English majors, it's very simple then to take that sequence of listening to Billie Holiday's song, showing students the drafts of Langston Hughes's poem, and then going into reading A Raisin in the Sun. That progression is very typical and works well for, a typical English classroom. But we're talking today about transformative learning, transformative text. So at NC State University, our course is called Transformative Texts in American Life, and we cater to a number of STEM students at our engineering school of about 39,000. And we see our class as a place to not only talk about texts that have been transformative in American life, as I just evidenced across multiple genres and decades, but ultimately texts that are also transformative to them. In what ways can they walk away and say, this is how this applies to me in my world? So your imagination is sparked. At NC State, students respond immediately to the idea of being on a college deferment, and they're already thinking about their loans being deferred. So when we want to connect with folks here, we go right to where they are in their lives, and they can remember waiting to get into school, and they know what is waiting for them in terms of their financial aid packages. So those things connect with them immediately. We put this in a 3-day sequence, and I'm happy to come back to this in discussion if anyone wants me to clarify anything more. About the 4th or 5th class period of each semester, students are introduced to Harlem, by Langston Hughes. The very next day in the spring semester, it's usually right after Martin Luther King Day, our students go over to our library, to our visualization gallery, where we have a 360-degree screen and 10 speakers, and they have a chance to be immersed in what happened when Martin Luther King visited NC State on July 31st, 1966. After locating Super 8 film footage that was stuffed in a closet here in Raleigh, I told our community the story that had been completely forgotten, that Martin Luther King spoke here on our campus. So students watch an 18-minute film contextualizing Dr. King's visit, documenting the fact that because nobody was excited about it at that time, nobody documented it or recorded it. Our local newspaper sent 0 photographers to cover Martin Luther King, even after he'd won the Nobel Prize. Then students go into that visualization gallery, they walk around and they see footage of that day. The only time we know of that Dr. King encountered a KKK rally in March that was intentionally organized to intimidate him and scare people from coming out and following him. And then we lead a discussion where we talk about that. That day then leads into our third and final day of the sequence, which is we introduce Letter from Birmingham Jail. The idea is that instead of students thinking about people like Dr. King being far away and distant, only doing things in Montgomery and Memphis and Washington, D.C., the sequence has now brought them into this atmosphere of thinking that famous people like this actually have been on their own campus in a building that fortunately still stands here on campus. For years, I struggled to try to think about in this class how to bring in Dr. King's voice, because that's so much more of his personality and essence than even his written word. And an incredible sequence of events that we had out at Stanford a couple years ago, where Roosevelt and Leroy Martin were in discussion, got me really thinking about how can we hear Dr. King's voice in a way that works in the sequence. So what we do now is I tracked down a record years ago, and it has this iteration on it of Dr. King delivering a message about Funtown. And the speech is from June 17th, 1962. And so on the third day, they talked about Dream Deferred, Harlem. They've gone to the visualization gallery, thought about the personal experiences. On the third day, when they read Letter for Birmingham Jail, we start off by actually having them hear Dr. King's voice talking about his daughter Yolanda, aka Yoki, which is mentioned in the Letter from Birmingham Jail, about her misunderstandings about why she can't go to an amusement park in Atlanta. And in the recording, Dr. King goes far beyond what he does by allusion in that written text. He talks about having to sit down for the first time and talk to one of his children about racism. That audio lasts about 5 minutes, and then we're off and away into talking about Dr. King's rhetoric, the transformative nature of what happens. I personally end that lesson by talking about, even though Dr. King's letter is so important and imperative, the real transformation happened when the photographs came out from the training done by people like Dorothy Cotton and James Bevel and Kelly Ingram Park. Getting those photographs of dogs attacking children and fire hoses are what actually moved the needle in Birmingham in the spring of 1963. So these 4 entities kind of play into this role in all these particular ways and in unique ways. And in terms of a Raisin in the Sun, I'm happy to come back and talk about that in any way you'd like to also. I'm going to share one other thing before we transfer into any questions or comments you have. And I want to show you one other thing that's possible that can be done with this. From time to time on that first of those 3 days when I teach Dream Deferred, I show this famous photo that was taken by Marion Palfy. Marion Palfy was a photographer that Langston Hughes championed. And when he was writing this collection, he was actually hoping some of her photographs would appear in the book Montage of a Dream Deferred. This picture is entitled In the Shadow of the Capitol, Washington, D.C. And about 6 days ago, my class had a discussion about this image in relation to your dreams being deferred. As you study it, you can see the children in the foreground. You can see something that probably resembles a broken scooter. And of course, iconically in the background is the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Photographs are also an important way to bring to light Langston Hughes' aesthetic for what he's doing in the poem and getting students to read kind of visual culture as they do in their everyday lives and then bring that into our discussion of poetry. Without doubt, whether our students are engineering seniors or beginning sophomores in their course called Transformational Text in American Life, they can understand this image as being something so out of reach, even when it's so close. And you can imagine the discussion going in many other directions after that. So I'm going to stop there for a second. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about the audio, the sequence of events, hear people's expertise that also teach these texts and use them well, and see where we can take our discussion in terms of thinking more about Hansberry, Hughes, Billie Holiday, Martin Luther King, and how this can fit in a sequence of transformative teaching.
Thank you, Jason. That was incredible. Um, so, I'm sure there are questions forming in the minds of our attendees. If you could use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to put your questions, I'll collate them and I'll read them for our speaker.
Yeah, well, Lonnie, Jason, if I could to take advantage of the fact that I have an audio function, and while people are collecting their thoughts after this remarkable set of remarks you've just made, and thank you very much. I wanted just off the top of my head a couple of questions and comments. I mean, one, I love the way you show the impact, the ripple effect of this poem. And while you were talking, I was thinking that I think it's Marianne Moore is often quoted as saying, "Poetry makes nothing happen." And what you've shown us is a way to show students that, in fact, that's not necessarily the case. I mean, this lineage that you described from Langston, from Billie Holiday to Langston Hughes to Lorraine Hansberry to Dr. King, making a speech with which everybody is familiar and that in some measurable way changed the world, is really a remarkable story about what a small literary text can do in the world. So I really appreciate that. Um, I wanted to ask also, since we're talking about teaching, I mean, the power of the photograph you put on toward the end um, is a reminder, and you alluded to this, that Dr. King's strategy was to put images of reality with which most Americans were not familiar out there. In those days, that meant publishing photographs and television, which was a relatively new medium. And in the expectation that seeing those images would change the public opinion and wake people up. Now, I have to assume that if you're teaching this material right now at NC State with students who probably have a range of opinions about contemporary politics, I have to believe that somebody, if not you yourself, is going to make the analogy to what we've been seeing on our screens in the last few weeks and months in Minneapolis and elsewhere. How do you handle that? I mean, do you let that happen? Do you let a discussion emerge about the parallels between then and now, or do you steer away from it? I'm just interested in what you do with that.
Thank you so much for that insight, Andy. That is exactly what happens all the time. And we kind of start usually by pointing out the fact that those powerful images did move the nation. And I usually ask the open-ended question, are we there now? When we see this kind of violence, do we have the same reaction? Who is moved? Who has access to these images? In a very real way, when we had that image, we had this discussion, again, I think it was 6 to 10 days ago in class, students freely shared, much to my surprise and delight, about how they feel about the world today. And they start in with, I can't believe how little has actually changed. I can't believe we're looking at these particular things. and they really do share these particular ideas. This is, as you said, extremely dangerous more and more often, especially at a public institution where we have all kinds of issues with people literally hiding cameras and recording people and people losing their jobs over that. That just happened about 7 days ago on campus. Students will engage once I've built a rapport with them, once they've talked about things in class, and I'm very happy about that. My role usually is to listen, let them share, clarify for accuracy, and I was quite pleased with the way that conversation went last time. And when students stay after class and talk to me, I talk to them about um, Trayvon Martin and how we went through this in the classroom way back in 2012, 2013, when Langston Hughes's poem Kids Who Die was circulated on the internet and became kind of a national sensation as a response to what was going on. And so Hughes is always there for these moments, as you said so well. And unfortunately, those moments are still there with us. And I'm pleased that students will engage that, even if it doesn't mention. I'm going to jump in on the Q&A if that was good enough, Andy.
Thank you very much indeed.
Just a factual answer. The photographer is one you should know. Her name is Marion Palfy, and it's Marion, last name Palfy, Palfi. Hughes really worked with a lot of people to mentor them, try to assist them, and help them. And Marion Palfy was one who took some unbelievable images and never had the breakthrough that other photographers did that Hughes worked with, such as Roy DeCarava, and incredible other artists and photographers like Gordon Parks, Henry Carter Brescian. So Palfy documented a lot of what went on in the civil rights movement. One of her most important essays came out of Greenwood, Mississippi. And you can find her photographs like that one. There's also another image she has of, it's called Wife of Lynching Victim. And she gets this picture of a woman who survived seeing her husband, Caleb Hill, lynched. And so her photography is really kind of a hidden gem in this particular regard. And again, for context, I introduce her work not just because it fits, but because they had a working relationship where Hughes tried to champion her. And that particular piece of work probably inspired Langston Hughes to write a poem called Children's Rhymes, which is in Montage of Dream Deferred. Very specifically, he wanted her photos in that copy of Montage of Dream Deferred. Give me a second to catch up with the other question. Linking written culture. Excellent question. Students in my class are allowed to engage multiple modes of scholarship and creative work for their final project. And so the last semester I taught this, I allow students to actually pitch me topics on what they want to do. And they can address any number of things that come up in our class. And one of the most beautiful relationships that emerged was I had two students from very different backgrounds collaborate on making a film where they interviewed female athletes on campus talking about how they feel in perspective to the way their male counterparts are treated and often exalted. And so what they had to do is they had to write up a brief of what they were going to do, supply the questions, go out and do the work. And they came back with a great summative presentation. And so I think it's a great way to think about this by introducing audio, photography, the genre of a play, and poetry and music. I really do signal in my class that all these genres are so applicable and important. From my perspective, music is simply poetry sent to music. And so it's another form of literature in its own genre. And so we welcome studies of music in all particular avenues. Because my next research project is on Nina Simone, I have a lot of students that want to pick up and talk about a Nina Simone text as transformative in this world. And so we have a lot of things on that. And then the final part of the question I see there, how do you help them connect the course to their goals for the rest of their educational journey? Outstanding question. One of the things that I try to do is quite often with a text like Harlem or even Theme for English B, I ask students to kind of reflect on how this means something to them. So I mentioned quickly with Harlem, students can think really quickly about how much of their life is deferred. If they're in an internship, they're almost graduated, they're almost out, they don't have a job. When they get the job, it won't be the job they want. They get this notion that America is always out in front of them, that every milestone they hit is just a stepstone to the thing they really want, which they never get to. More interestingly, and I think I really want to say this, the poem Theme for English B resonates with students. It's another poem by Langston Hughes. In that poem, the instructor teacher asks the students to go home and write a page and basically have that writing assignment tell the instructor who they are. Hughes's poem is a poem instead of a piece of prose. And the student kind of fudges on the assignment. They're subversive. They're a little bit rebellious. The instructors ask for an essay that should move in narrative, and the student provides a poem that moves through metaphor. And the metaphor is very, very instructive. The writer, speaker of that poem says, the page that I write will be just like you, instructor, but it'll also be like me because we need each of us that's American. And students usually don't see on a first or second go through that the poem is talking about the white page with black letters as the metaphor for the kind of America the student imagines. If the page were only white, then there's nothing interesting going on. If the page is only black, we can't see anything. To read, we need a white page with black letters, both working together across those kind of color images. So I actually encourage students to be subversive and rebellious and make their own take on their assignments, and sometimes listen to the information they get, but then also realize maybe they can go in another direction. So the poems of Hughes often kind of try to tap into that notion of when can you stretch the limits, boundaries, move beyond them, or when can you find ways to be creative in that particular regard and talk about a number of things. Thank you for those two wonderful questions and thinking about scholarship and creative work and songs and who these photographers are.
Jason, since we have apparently a little bit of a shy group out there today, so while we're waiting for more questions that I hope we'll get, I will want to ask a couple more if I may. And one of them is probably not very controversial, but the second one I'm wrestling with whether I should ask it, but I probably will. The first one is where you started when you showed us the manuscript of the poem and you showed us how Langston Hughes started with the word rot
Mm-hmm.
and changed it to the word fester. You're showing your students something about the writing process there, and I'm curious to know: did they find? Are they interested in that? Do they want to talk about what revision is all about and why one word is has a different impact than another word? I'm hoping the answer is yes, but tell us a little bit about that if you would.
Thank you for that wonderful question, Andy. Let me pull up the second page and then the first page of this. Let's do the first page one more time and I'll address that. I think it's a great way to think about this particular iteration. Students are indeed thoughtful about the writing process, and I'll start as you guided us so well. They often don't understand, right, that poems are revised, revisited, changed, and altered. And so this image is a great one to think about how things evolve, alter, and of course, in the language of our course, transform in this particular way. And there's another image that I point to. If you look at the bottom of this one, Hughes gets the notion of syrupy right. But there's another draft that's just hilarious where he can't remember how to spell it. And you're not looking at it now, but there's one where you can see him just doing something every human being does, right? Where does the Y go? Is there two used? And it's really funny to see an acclaimed artist, writer in their process in a particular way. What I usually emphasize with this draft is a couple things, and I know one of them may be hard to see just because of the setup, but above the word memorandum, Hughes actually made a star and he circled it. And so I pause there with students and I say, what do you think that's about? And eventually they kind of get to, I think he liked this. I think he thought it was pretty good. And I say, you're absolutely right, because the top left-hand corner is all the staple marks where he continued to attach it to the next versions and drafts. And in fact, this is the only handwritten copy of any poem they kept that made its way into Montage of Dream Deferred. So Hughes really wanted to document this and keep this. So we talk about being excited about writing, even when it's not finished. We talk about changes. And then the most important thing, because this is all introductory for students thinking about rhythm, is I point out the changes Hughes did make on this page. It's very interesting that he seems so concerned with rhythm. To remove a word like or, to remove a word like they, right? Or does it? These are rhythmic choices, right? And they can get into it right away when they think about how music works and functions. And so they get that notion a great deal about it, and becomes kind of useful for them. I'm also going to stop and then share the next page. This is how the poem continues. This is the very next page. And this will be new for us to look at as well. And, great writers also have images they need to get rid of. And so Hughes asks, has anybody heard what happens to a dream deferred? Does it just disappear in air as might smoke somewhere? And the idea of going up in smoke must seem a little trite, right? That's a bit cliche. It's a little overwrought. And of course, we talk about these lines that Hughes made about inverting. He wants, even though smoke is first on the page, might to go in front of it and working through it in this particular avenue. But even, the things you write don't make it to the final draft in this particular way. And so they are interested in thinking about this. And what I try to do is also just get them excited for their own projects, to realize that there's so much more information in a world out there about whatever topic they choose, not just the final iteration or final version, whether it's photography, Marion Palfy, whether it's the handwritten drafts. There's a lot to discover. And I think, to kind of tie back the last question to yours, that kind of curiosity is really contagious, is spilling over. And I think it can be one of the benefits of an effective class like this, which is you can be interested and curious about things that aren't in your major, and kind of try to inform and perpetuate that into the eventual fields we choose and pick in life.
That's great. Thank you. I'll save my other question for later if we have time, but there's a question from Sarah Markgraf that would be good to address if you can.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Sarah. I see you wrote other texts I teach. How does Harlem fit in as a whole? Say more about collaborative projects. Very often, Hughes is kind of this opening introduction for students to get us to thinking about Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. But where we eventually get is to really vast and unique reading assignments in our course. We listen to court cases. We have songs that are played. As I mentioned before, I bring in Nina Simone's lyrics, particularly to her collaboration with Langston Hughes, called Backlash Blues. Students will also do research projects on things like Cinderman. And we listen to Frederick Douglass, and we hear a debate in which James Baldwin speaks and talks with William Buckley, to name a few. So in many ways, this particular text is meant to kind of be an example of shorter iterations of things that students who aren't English majors can kind of engage with, understand, and then explore further. And they also become ways for students to kind of have that bit of introduction to all the genres we'll see ahead in terms of kind of moving beyond things. And many of our classes here will also show films quite often in this particular way. And the collaborative projects, I'm glad you asked about, because to me, they're really beneficial for what kind of students can accomplish and become a part of. And it's energizing teaching and creating a transformative text class at your university and your school. I remember the first semester I did one of our classes, I had the students come in and present, and one student brought his guitar in, another brought their banjo in, and they were actually really high caliber players. And there was a young lady off to the side of the road that after the banjo player finished, talked about that item as kind of indicative of understanding American culture and thinking about its production and what it has created. She turned to a friend and she said, "This is what I thought college was going to be." And what she meant was her parents had, right, idolized and memorialized and romanticized these notions of, hanging out in green grass and talking to different people and picking up the vibes of what it is to be at a university campus. And so all these particular things make their way into our course, and I allow students to be collaborative on them when they self-select. And so if I could just go back to kind of the entire process, by the time we get to like the last month, I spell out a number of things that students can take on for their final assignments. And one of them is to pick up on a conversation we've had and kind of expound upon it in different ways they want to. And so students will often then get together. I don't allow it to be more than groups of three, one or two. And I've had students build websites on Wix for free that are engaging with photography, history, and telling the story of what's going on. And they're working together, and I work through them in terms of who's responsible for what section. So there isn't that kind of typical animosity and problems that happens when you say, I did this much work, someone else did something else. But the collaboration for me, and I try not to get too excited about this, but for me, it's an extension of what the classroom experience is. When I come into the classroom after at least 10 days or 14 days, I expect my students to be engaging with themselves just because they're interested in each other and because that's a space and place where dialogue and discussion and conversation happens. And so I do a lot of small group work, the old classic think, pair, share, and then have students break off. But I make sure that the students get to know each other. It's that kind of a course where the stakes are lower, even though that classroom is one of the biggest, courts they'll ever play in. It's a big deal for them. But I want the stakes to be low. I want the assignments to be approachable. And I really am encouraged by the way that they do end up working together on these particular things. So Sarah, thank you for that. I'm going to pause for a second. I see a couple other questions. If you all just give me a moment to catch up. I believe Michelle said, yeah, the recent news about Medgar Evers' home and memorial changed. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'll tell you, this is not something that does not come up in my class. One student last semester, in the wake of the Bob Dylan movie, A Complete Unknown, really wanted to explore a song that I shared with them, which was the great, great song, Another Only a Pawn in Their Game. And just last semester, I had a student do their final research project on contemporizing what's been going on with Beckwith, what's been going on with Medgar Evers, and exactly where Dylan performed that song. And he even had an incredible research question. You could tell I learned a lot from my students. They're a good group here. This student asked, he realized that Bob Dylan stopped singing Only a Pawn in Their Game right after Beckwith was let out and acquitted. And so he had this very, very wonderful research question. He was wondering if Dylan himself was worried about any repercussions of the song now that Beckwith could possibly take some kind of, measures against him. In the end, he found out that was not the case, that Dylan simply stopped singing the song for other personal reasons. The faux motorcycle accident, changes in his direction. But it was a wonderful way to think about these things. And so his project did engage with kind of modern day things that are going on, such as what's happening with Medgar Evers even today in this particular way, and even with why we know some of the folks and highlight them this way. So thank you for bringing that incredibly important name and personage into this space. And there is one other person here, a much longer text. Don't have the time to make all the connections. How do you approach teaching it differently? We had long conversations here at NC State when Noah Stroh was leading us so ably and thinking about what can we get done in the course, people that are being introduced to all these new texts. And one of the things that a lot of people settled on was often in the lesson, students are going to need some kind of context. It can be as short as 2 minutes, can be maybe as much as five, maybe not more than 10. We approach the entire project here as we are not the experts on every single thing we're teaching. We're learning along with the students, with the texts that we engage with and have. And so we kind of position ourselves in that way that we're asking questions along the way. But very often, when we have kind of an excerpt or a truncated text like this, we try to cover some of that in the first 3 to 5 minutes, or we provide like a written summary that students can have on their own by way of kind of an introduction to things. We do start backwards, which I think is the heart of the question. We start backwards and saying we do not want our students reading 20 pages a day, often not even 10 pages a day, sometimes as little as 3 or 5. And the engagement that they make with that, even though it's shorter, can still evaluate all the skills, practices that we work at. And so when students have a shorter text in my classroom, what I often do is I teach them the first week the skills of annotating, and that includes circling, underlining, writing comments, asking questions. And so I'll tell them when you come in with your hard course packet, nothing's electronic in our classes. You have to have a physical copy of things to engage. We get people off the computers, no phones in this particular classroom. You're just going to engage with the writing. Then what I'll do is I will say in that 7-page writing, take a picture of page 5 and send it in the next minute to my email, and I will be grading your annotations. And I do that throughout the semester consistently so that students realize that even though we're not asking them to read 10, 12, 20 pages, what we are asking them to read, we're asking them to engage in, respond to, and think about carefully. And so we start backwards with what's the appropriate amount, what can we work with, and can we go at? And I'm just going to say this. I know this is being recorded, but I'm going to say it anyway. The first semester that I taught our Teagle course, my day ended with my graduate course called Langston Hughes from Popular Culture to the Civil Rights Movement. It's the only course in America taught just about Langston Hughes. By about the third week of the semester, I was more excited to walk into my Teagle course in the morning than I was to see my graduate students in the evening. It was that much of a remarkable experience. And I said that publicly here on our campus, so we might as well have it on screen here in this particular way. But when you really latch on to a community of people that are cross disciplines, so here we're working with historians, psychologists, people in social work, social studies, and you start to see these texts outside of your own discipline when we get stuck in our old habits of frameworks of this is how we do things in literary studies. This is how I do things as a historian. It really refreshes you and energizes you into thinking about new ways of approaching the literature and kind of undoing those stale models of the expert, the sage in front of the classroom that's going to answer all the questions correctly. And so starting for us with those very small excerpts, demanding students read it, and then coming at it collectively has really been a remarkable experience that I wouldn't have wanted to miss. And I tell you, when you've been at it for a couple decades, that's the kind of refreshing we all need.
I want to make, thank you so much. I want to make clear nobody asked Jason to say that. Right. I really appreciate that. I'll save my bigger question for another time, but I do have one. You've pointed us to so many wonderful resources here. Uh, are there links that people can go to to hear Dr. King speaking about Funtown and his daughter? Is there a link that you can go to hear the James Baldwin William Buckley debate and so on? And if so, we'd love to share those with our participants. Do they exist? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, and then Jason, the images you showed us of Langston Hughes, his own handwriting and his process. Are those available online? Is it publicly available?
So thank you for that. I'd be happy to share multiple links here. There are kind of resources that I can put together, and I'm not quite as adept as others to do this quickly, but I'll be happy to pass those along for any participants and maybe pass them along to Lonnie. But the photographs, I think Lonnie's already found. The images of Hughes's poem aren't necessarily easy to find online, but they are certainly public record and knowledge. I've republished them in several books, and I know that Yale has made them visually seeable. They're just not easy to find. Let me think a little bit about exactly where those are. But in terms of the Funtown audio, absolutely, that can be shared, and a couple of other things that I think are there, and that photograph that I thank Lonnie for tracking down in these particular ways, and resources and are there. And there's a couple other things out there that have kind of been turned into lessons and other ideas. And of course, we already have in the packet, Lonnie so kindly put together the Hughes poem, really nice summary on Billie Holiday. I think I skipped saying the fact that Billie Holiday would often perform that as the last song of the evening at Cafe Society. Often the wait staff would not even serve drinks or food. And after the single spotlight remained, she would often walk out the back door. And again, Hughes didn't just have this song on vinyl. This was something he saw in person, being right there in Harlem. And more importantly, his connection to Holiday is very, very personal. He only kept two photographs at his studio at 20 East 127th Street. One was of Elsie Roxborough, a woman who proposed to him several times, and the other was of Billie Holiday. So he was really inspired by Holiday's work in this particular way. But photographs like that, the Palfi images, the audio for Funtown, I think we can share, and delighted that people would be interested in that.
That would be great. Thank you so much. Lonnie, we're kind of coming to the hour of adjournment. I can't thank you enough, Jason. This has been a really stimulating and chock full of very concrete teaching suggestions, and clearly just listening to you, I'm sure I'm speaking for everybody on the call. We can tell what a extraordinary experience your students are having. And I love that you said that you learn from your students, because one of the things we believe about this kind of teaching is that it refreshes the teacher as much as the students, and you've exemplified that today.
Well,
Go ahead, please.
thank you for that, Andy. And I'll just transition us out to say, please, if you're out there, stick around, ask questions, and learn more about the TEAGLE program. It is transformative for you and your students in your university. And as I've said on many occasions, Lonnie, Annie, Andy, and Roosevelt, who's worked with us, has just been the best possible people. So I know that they'll continue to answer your questions and have such an important role to play in where the humanities and the really foundations of what we all believe in are going. And I very sincerely thank them for all they've already done and are continuing to do.